So now we are going to talk about the compositions endpoint. And to be honest, this is mostly where people get stuck, especially when they are coming to OpenAIR for the first time. And there are a lot of reasons to that because compositions tie almost everything about OpenAIR together. And compositions actually are the data that you store. Now it takes, let's take a minute and look at what compositions are again in a little bit more detail. So before we get to the API, let's have a look at this. So now again, as we said before, compositions are like the piece of paper in which you actually write the data and you store it within an EHR, right? So with that analogy in mind, you need to understand that every time we post a piece of information to the OpenAIR server, it needs to validate it against many things. And out of these, the first level of validation happens at the template level. So it means that you can only record data that you have explicitly already mentioned in the template. So for example, if you have a template that has only blood pressure and pulse, you cannot record body weight as a part of that template. So in that composition, you cannot record body weight. So that's obvious, right? Like if you don't have a section, but technically that's where the problem is actually. In paper, you can record it even if it's not part of the form. You can just write it on the piece of paper, like on the side. But with OpenAIR, it's digital and you can't record things that you don't explicitly mention in the template. So template level validation is number one. Then there are archetype level validations. So the archetype is, again, you make the template using the archetype. So obviously the rules that are present in the archetypes will also go to the template. So these are rules like, for example, in the blood pressure archetype, the only unit that's allowed is millimeter of Hg. So if you suddenly wanted to record the blood pressure using some other unit, like let's say kilograms, you can't do that because in the archetype they have said that it's millimeters of mercury. So that's the only thing that's allowed. Now after that, there is also the reference model level validation. So again, these two validations on the top, the template level and the archetype level, happen using the OPT file that you provide. And in fact, if you take a look at the web template, you can easily see all the validations that are happening. So I'll just show you quickly how that looks like. So let's take a look at, let's see what template is selected right now. Okay, patient monitoring.v0. All right. And let's get the web template using this. So you can see here that the web template is again a simplified version of the template. And if you, let's go to one of our, okay. So here, there is an archetype called well-being score, and I just created this archetype to record the physical well-being of a patient. So it's a scale from 0 to 10, indicating how the patient is feeling. Now, again, here, the validation check says that it can only be from 0 to 10. And yeah, that makes sense because that is, again, it's coming from the archetype. I put it in there and it makes sense for the validation to happen. So similarly, there are validations that happen at the reference model level. So now, again, if we come here, we see that this is a DV count. So again, the RM type is the reference model type. We'll look at this more in detail in the next video. But for now, know that there are only, there is a specific data type that this expects. So in this case, DV count, it expects an integer. So you cannot pass it a string. So that is the level of validation that happens at the reference model. So that being said, now let's actually take a look at the composition endpoint. So composition endpoint has many things in the OpenAIR REST API, the main ones being able to create compositions, being able to retrieve them back, updating compositions and deleting compositions. Now this, again, the original OpenAIR REST API supports only two types of compositions. One is JSON and the other is XML. And they are both equivalent if you think about it. They are both the same type of data, but just being represented as either XML or JSON. And these data points are actually instances of the whole template. So if you look at the template, right, if you look at the template that you just posted, this is a huge XML file. Now, the composition takes all of the information from the template and tries to place in data wherever it needs to. And that's how these work. And these are called canonical JSON and canonical XML, and they will always be supported by OpenAIR. And they will always have full support by OpenAIR. Now, if we come back to the EHR scape endpoint and look at the composition here, so we see that this also has a composition API, but the main difference here is that it supports additional formats called flat and structured. Now, flat format looks something like this. It's a much more simplified format, and you can immediately see the data that's being captured. And structured format again looks very similar to that. It's just that it's a little bit more nested. And for example, here the way they represent objects is they just put a pipe sign and they represent two things like unit and magnitude like this. And the way they capture an array, that is if there are multiple elements, is they put a 0 right here, for example. Okay, this composition, for example here, so any event 0, so meaning there can be multiple events. And if you remember in the template, when you are designing it, you might you have the ability to change the cardinality and the min and max values. So this is how you represent it in a simplified flat format. The same thing using a structured format will look just like an array. It will have an array and you can represent that within an array. Now, how do you get this composition? Now, there are many ways to actually get a composition, but the easiest way till date is the example endpoint. So again, you have an example endpoint in the template section. So template/example, and you just put the template ID and you say example/example, and then you say the format in which you want the composition. Now this will generate a composition for you. So let's just try that out. So right now it's generated an example in the XML format. Let's look at JSON, for example. So let's look at canonical JSON. And this is how it looks like. And if you see closely here, you can see all of the different data points being captured. So for example, things like DV count, the well-being score, for example, is being captured here. And it's saying it's just generated a random example of 5. Again, another example of duration being captured here. And so the thing about the canonical JSON format is that it's a little complicated. You need to go through the tree quite a lot and understand where the actual data is, and it's not that straightforward to understand which data is which part of the template. But you do have some helpers, like for example, you have the archetype node ID. So you can look at this and compare it with that in the web template or the template and identify that this is the data point. But in all honesty, we usually use something called the simplified formats, and these are the structured and the flat JSON. So let's just take a look at the same data point, how it looks like when it comes to flat. And again, you see that it's much more simpler, and we have, for example, the well-being score, and it's captured immediately. And this is index 0. Same thing, they have another index 1. And so that means they're capturing 2 well-being scores in this case. And we also have other things like, let's see. So here we have the weight, and the magnitude is 500. So this person apparently weighs 500 kgs. So we have all of this example data that we can just take and use. Now, you just copy this after you get the example, and then you place it inside the composition endpoint. So again, under flat, let's just paste that here. And that will give you the full composition right here. Now you need to make sure that you have the correct EHR ID selected here and the template ID as well. And once you have all of these, you just make sure that the format is the format that you asked it to generate, and you click on send. And that will create a composition. Now, this seems easy to do. You just get an example, you just modify the data a little, and then you put it there. But this has taken a lot of effort from the side of EHR base as well to implement. In fact, this feature was just implemented 4 or 5 days ago. And it makes things much simpler. But we will also look at how to generate these compositions yourself and what it really means by what do these data points really mean. We'll take a look at that in more detail in the next section. But for now, let's take a look at what else the composition API has to offer. Now, again, we have two composition APIs. One is the EHR Scape composition API and the official OpenAIR REST composition API. Now, again, as I said before, official API only accepts canonical JSON and canonical XML, but we can retrieve it again in these same formats, so XML and JSON. So now, again, the good thing about this is that once we have a composition inside the system, you can retrieve it back in any format. So it doesn't matter what format you are using to persist. As long as it's in the system, you can retrieve it back in JSON, XML, flat, or structured, and they will all be equivalent to one another. So now, when you look at the UID, there are two UIDs that you need to keep in mind. So one is the versioned UID. So this is actually a versioned UID. And the other is just the ID. So this, for example, just this UUID, which stops at BAA8, that will just be the ID. So I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to put it inside the composition ID. And the full UUID, I'm going to call it something called composition UID. And again, these environment variables are already there as part of the collection. So I'm just going to paste this here. So we'll see how these two are different and how each endpoint takes something slightly different. So if you want to read this composition back, you can just use the read API and you can click on send, and that will give you all of the details that you have here. The exact same thing that you posted. You can also update the composition. So for example, you made a mistake, you want to update this. Let's go back here. And again, it's a good practice to just copy this as it is. So I'm just going to copy this. And let's stop here. So this is the composition. The remaining things are metadata. So make sure you don't copy everything. Just need the composition to update it. So let's paste this here. And here in this case, I'm using the composition ID, which is a UUID. It looks like a UUID. Okay. So once we have that, we can just put this as a JSON. Let's paste that in. And headers, we have application JSON. That should be okay. And it updated it. Okay. So now if you see closely in the update, it does not tell anything about the UUID. But if you go back to the read and if you get it again, it would have changed the composition UUID a little bit. So you see here, there is a UID here, and it has changed the version to version 2. So all of the compositions in OpenAIR are versioned, and you can't actually delete them. There always remains a version of the composition, and they'll always be versioned. And there are APIs which you can use to get a state of a particular composition in one particular time. So there are things like that you can see, but those are more advanced topics which we won't be going into right now. So that's about it. So you have the flat format, you have the structured format, you have the JSON format and the XML format that you can use. Now you have the same functionality in the OpenAIR REST API as well. You can create a composition just by sending it. So it has created it, and it will give you so you can look at the UID here. So UID is again the complete versioned object ID. Okay. So part of this is the actual ID. So the first part of it is the ID, and the full part is the versioned UID. So always make sure whenever you are working with the ID in the REST API, you make sure that you use this, and whenever it's UID, you make sure that it's the complete thing. So again, we'll just copy this and put it in our environment. So the composition UID will be the full thing, and the composition ID will just be this first part. So this is important because multiple things take in a slightly different version. So if you want to update using the official OpenAIR REST API, what you do is you need to use the composition ID here. So this is the composition ID. And for example, so let's just take the same exact composition and let's paste it here. Let's just say that we want to change something. So instead of healthcare facility John Doe, let's make it John Doe Junior. Okay. So now if you can put that, but you also need to mention the composition UID in the if match header. So this is very similar to the EHR endpoint where we have to provide the full versioned ID in order for it to update. So again, you need to make sure that if match is there, and this should be the full UID. So once we have both of this, you can send that, and that will update the composition. Now you can also delete a composition. So again, this is the composition UID. You can use the composition ID as well. So in this case, composition ID, just click on delete and it'll tell you 409 conflict. And the reason is because the delete endpoint takes the full UID. Okay. So composition UID. And okay, so I think this has already been used up. So the current version of this composition is actually 2 because we updated this, right? So again, if you go back and try to retrieve this using the composition ID and you see the object UID here, it will be version 2. So whenever you are deleting it, you need to make sure that you are providing it the latest UID, and that's why it errors out with the 409 conflict. So let's again put in the full UID here and let's try to delete it now. And now it's deleted that that particular version. So just because it's deleted doesn't mean that the composition has completely been removed from the database. In fact, if you go here and if you want to retrieve the composition, it will tell you that there is no content, but there are still ways to get the previous version of this particular composition using the versioned composition APIs. That again, you can take a look at the Swagger UI. Right now, we are not covering that. So deleting just deletes it from all the queries. It doesn't show up in the queries, but the data is still there. You can retrieve it if you want to. Now, similarly, again, we also have a read API here. We have an update API here. We have a very similar delete API here. And in fact, if you try to delete the composition ID, it will just tell you that it's not found because we already deleted this. So you can just play around with it. For your task, you will need to create a realistic composition for your template, and you have to store it within your own EHR ID. And as I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but the EHR ID is always a part of the composition endpoint, and you need to make sure that you use the right EHR ID and store a sample composition that you generate, and make sure that it's realistic. So don't have values like 500 kg or 500 millimeters of mercury blood pressure. So have some realistic values and try to post them in the clinical data repository. So I think that will tie in all of these things that you've done. So creating a template, creating an EHR, and then now you will be creating a composition. So that's about it for this video. Thank you for watching. This video was part of the OpenEHR course that's available on the Medblocks e-learning platform. I believe that the best way to learn a topic is to actually do it yourself and learn by doing it. So we have a lot of tasks for you in the course that we'll help you do, along with more video content just like this. And if you're interested in that, please do check it down in the link below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.